Good afternoon. My name is Monique King-Veland, and I'm an Associate Vice President in the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center here at the Urban Institute. And I'm also the moderator for the Revitalizing and Reimagining the DMV After COVID-19 event series. Before we start, some quick housekeeping. The event is being recorded, and the recording will be posted online afterwards. Speaker bios are available online at urban.org, and a link to the bios will be posted in the chat. We have closed captions turned on. If you'd like to adjust your settings, click the live transcription button at the bottom of your screen. All participants are muted, but you can send questions or comments in the Q&A box at any time. And we hope to have enough time for audience Q&A at the end. And finally, if you tweet about the event, please tweet using the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. Two weeks ago marked 1 year since George Floyd was murdered in Minnesota. And sadly, George Floyd was only one of 243 Black people killed by police in 2020. But his murder became a tipping point for a racial justice reckoning and uprising across the country and around the world. His murder prompted a surge of more than 7,000 Black Lives Matter demonstrations that quickly spread from Minneapolis across the country and the world. The movement centered around ending anti-Black police violence, sparked calls for racial justice, defunding the police, and police accountability. In 2015, the Washington Post began to log every fatal shooting by an on-duty police officer in the US. In that time, there has been more than 5,000 such shootings recorded by the Post, amounting to about 1,000 per year. And though about half the people shot and killed by police are white, Black Americans are shot at a disproportionate rate. Though we only account for less than 13% of the US population, we are killed at more than twice the rate of white Americans. While white people are killed by police at a rate of 15 per million, Latinx people are killed by police at a rate of 27 per million, and Black Americans at a rate of 36 per million. According to the Post, since 2015, 14 of the 17 people shot and killed by police in Washington, D.C. were Black people. During the same time period in Maryland, 54 of the 92 people shot and killed by police were Black people. And in Virginia, 45 of the 110 people shot and killed by police were Black people. And even more disturbing, a December 2020 study by the Children's National Hospital in DC that examined the use of force by police against children found that Black children were 6 times and Latinx children were 3 times more likely to be shot to death by police than white children. Let me put this another way, the way that I see the world and what keeps me up at night. My son, a brilliant, creative, and inquisitive teenager, and my daughter, a feisty, artistic, and smart elementary student, are 6 times more likely to be shot and killed by police than a white child. The police who are supposed to protect them and our family. As Dr. Goyal from Children's Hospital noted, any death of a child is devastating, but when it is due to police violence, it leads to distrust in the system and undermines the primary mission to protect. The pattern of stark racial and ethnic disparities only adds to this tragedy, further oppressing and alienating communities of color. It's important to investigate, identify, and correct these policies and personnel that perpetuate and exacerbate these disparities. In recent months, as the 1-year anniversary of George Floyd's death approached, state and city lawmakers across the country, sparked by community and grassroots activists, began to enact a variety of legislation aimed at reform and accountability. Over 30 states have passed more than 140 new police oversight and reform laws, according to a New York Times analysis of data from the National Conference of State Legislatures. From Illinois to New York City to Maryland, right here in the DMV, which decades ago became the first state to adopt a law enforcement officer's Bill of Rights and recently became the first state to do away with it. From limiting officer immunity to mandating body cameras, to restricting neck restraints and no-knock warrants, to reducing police budgets and reallocating resources, these approaches have varied and been met with applause and skepticism. Because even since the enactment of new laws and the conviction of Officer Chauvin, more Black lives have been lost to police violence. So it begs the question, what are the right strategies or mix of strategies needed to protect communities of color in the DMV? And as a Black woman, mother, and DMV resident, this conversation hits both personally and professionally. And I'm thankful for being able to moderate such an important discussion. Our conversation this afternoon will focus on police funding and reform in the region and provide a contextualized discussion on pathways for reform and the next steps for local movements. I'm honored to be joined by four incredible panelists: Jessie Janetta, Ashanti Martinez, Dr. Bethany Young, and the Honorable Juanica Fisher. I encourage you all to refer to their bios, and please join me in virtually welcoming our panelists. Jessie, let's start with you. I've shared some high-level data about the disproportionate rate of Black Americans that die at the hands of police across the country and right here in the DMV. But can you provide some more contextualized understanding of what policing looks like for Black and Brown people in the region, and what the data and evidence says about why the call for defunding police, police reform, and police accountability has been so loud in our region?
Sure, thank you, Monique. I just think we need to start the conversation with the basic context of the gross racial disproportionality that's a fundamental fact of policing in the DMV and throughout the United States. I mean, simply put, Black and Brown people, and particularly Black and Indigenous people in the United States and in the DMV, they're stopped more, they're arrested more, and they're more subject to police force at all levels, up to and including lethal force, than other people in this country. I live in Montgomery County, Maryland. There was a recent analysis of Montgomery County Police Department data. 18% of residents in Montgomery County are Black. A third of motorists stopped by MCPD are Black, and 44% of people arrested by MCPD are Black. In the District of Columbia, the ACLU recently did an analysis of stop and frisks conducted by the Metropolitan Police Department. 46% of residents of the District of Columbia are Black, but 72% of people who are stopped and frisked by MPD are Black. And while the proportions and the points in the justice system vary, I mean, this is a story that you see throughout the United States when you look at policing and at justice system involvement in general. And I think that that's the backdrop. Also, Monique, you started us very powerfully with the conversation about lethal encounters with police. And it's important to put alongside that the understanding that police contact comes with a price, comes with harms at all levels of intensity. For example, there's research looking at the effects of police contact on youth, and particularly Black youth, and finds that police contact does have negative effects observable at 6, 12, and 18 months. And that's contact, that's not even arrest necessarily. So I think this, this has been a situation that's been there for decades and decades, decades upon decades, and the efforts to address it have been there as well. I think that, certainly in my experience, I have never seen the ambition and the breadth of the policy and public conversation about these issues in terms of what is under consideration for being changed as wide open as it has been, certainly since, the mass, protests against police violence after George Floyd and Breonna Taylor were killed. That is in many ways an organizing and advocacy story. I'm not even sure that the call has gotten louder exactly, but I think it's become audible and audible in a different way to more and different ears just over the past year and a half.
Thank you so much, Jesse, especially for the clarification too on lethal and non-lethal and the different levels of interactions. I want to transition to Ashanti. Ashanti, PG Changemakers Coalition developed a set of demands and called demands focused on transforming the Prince George's County Police Department, including a strategy of redistributing existing resources from the PD. Can you talk a little bit about those demands and how they were developed?
Absolutely. I first want to thank you guys for having PG Changemakers here for this discussion, because I think it's so vital to have community be part of a discussion about their safety and about what public safety can look like as we start to reimagine it. Just to give some context, PG Changemakers was founded after the murder of George Floyd last June. In that same time frame, there was 2 police killings in Prince George's fairly recently. There was William Green and Leonard Shan that had happened. And so as William Green happened and all the protests sparked a movement throughout the country, we in Prince George's County wanted to bring our own changes to our community because we knew these things were not things that just happened in other places, they happened in our communities too. We also were under a new police chief. Hank Stawinski had left because of the Graham report. The redacted Graham report was released in June. And so he had stepped down immediately. And the Graham report is tied to a lawsuit towards the Prince George's County because of discrimination and abuses within the police department towards officers of color. So our demands are within 3 different buckets. The first one is answer us. We wanted to institute a very transparent hiring process for the new police chief with community input being centered. We also wanted a repeal of LEOBR, the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights. We wanted to pass Anton's Law to help strengthen the Public Information Act in Maryland. We wanted to ensure that police officers lived in the county because a huge percentage of them don't. And how do you develop community policing if you don't police the communities you live in? And then we also wanted to take law enforcement officers out of school. We wanted SROs to be removed, student or school resource officers to be removed from schools and put back into communities and actually police communities. The next bucket is to empower us. We wanted to cut police funding and reinvest in these communities. We wanted to allow for the disclosure of all investigations into police misconduct under the Maryland Public Information Act. We wanted to include community activists on civilian review boards, as well as have community be at the negotiating table for police contracts. And the last bucket, protect us. We wanted to fire all officers who assault residents, use racist language, or have been proven to be racially biased. We wanted to ban no-knock warrants in the county, as well as demilitarize our police force by banning the use of the 1033 program, as well as pass laws that prohibit use of excessive force. And so throughout us calling for these demands, I know the county executive, Angela Also-Brooks, created a task force, a working group to kind of talk about what we're doing in policing in the county and come up with a group of recommendations. And our co-founder, Chris Orietta, had the privilege of sitting on that working group and working through those recommendations.
Thank you so much, Ashanti. And I want to come back to the recommendation around redistributing resources in a bit, but I want to transition over to Dr. Young. Dr. Young, the DC Police Reform Commission has also put together a list of recommendations on police practices and community safety policies that you advised on. Can you tell us a little bit about those recommendations and how they are designed to move the needle on protecting Black, Indigenous people of color and improving community and police relations?
Certainly, and thank you again, Monique and Jesse, for inviting me to be here or back here with Urban. Jesse, you kind of went over some of the statistics around DC, but as somebody who grew up in this area, I was born in DC and grew up in Maryland. You know, for those of us who are from here, you know that means you're kind of from both, although DC residents will tell me not to claim it. But it used to be the chocolate city, right? And it's not so much that anymore, but our criminal legal system is very chocolate. For 46% of the population to be Black people, the statistics are that 93% of the people sentenced in DC are Black, 90% of the people incarcerated in DC are Black. And Jesse, you called out the ACLU statistics, but the commission actually did another analysis of NPD stop data that separated out non-traffic stops from traffic stops, and it's a little starker. that Black people made up 86% of non-traffic stops and 76% of stops altogether. Another quote, another statistic that I'll highlight that was in a 538 study published earlier this year was that MPD arrested Black people at a per capita rate 7 times higher and killed Black people at a rate 13 times higher than white people. So hold that. And then the other piece of this is that Black people in DC are disproportionately the victims of violent crime. In 2020, there were 198 people killed by homicide in DC. That's a 20% increase in just 1 year. Of those 198 people, 189 of them were Black. You know, so a lot of the justification that we hear for increasing the size of police forces and having more aggressive policing comes down to violence. But if you hold those two sets of statistics, that the people who are most impacted by violence are also the most impacted by abuses of the system created to combat that violence. It's kind of what motivated the DC Police Reform Commission and the 16,000 residents who testified before the council about a need to address public safety in a different way. And our starting point at the Reform Commission was that policing is not the most effective means of providing public safety to the DC community, and that the public safety that DC residents deserve requires the consideration of not just crime or crime reduction, but the determinants of crime, which we know are broader than the end result of the crime that we end up seeing. We don't have a safe community if everyone in that community does not have access to basic resources, whether it be housing, physical and mental health care, safe schools, and safe roads, and importantly, have a voice in determining the policies that will effectuate the provision of those resources. So the recommendations from the commission were in 8 buckets, to borrow Ashanti's term, and those centered around re-engineering DC's emergency response system so that incidents related to behavioral health and other life crises are met with specialized skill and compassion rather than police force. Strengthening the social safety net, especially for vulnerable residents, and also decriminalizing poverty. So some of these low-level offenses that are often the result of people trying to meet their basic needs, decriminalizing those and decreasing police contact for that kind of behavior. Replacing police in schools, replacing them with affirming healing strategies that we know are better suited to promote nurturing and safe learning environments where young people, especially youth of color, can excel. The recommendations also covered community-based violence interventions. As I mentioned, policing has not been the most effective tool at reducing violence, as we can see from those numbers we talked about. And instead relying on community-based interventions to do that job. The commission also made recommendations around ending harmful and unnecessary encounters between police and youth, and taking a developmentally appropriate approach to ensure the well-being of young people in DC that rely on community expertise and not just police. And those kind of the policies and the strategies, the policies that the commission focused on, I'll highlight a few. Jump outs, as they're known in DC, or stop and frisk, as they're known in other places. Pretextual stops, consent searches, which when we look at the fact that it's mostly Black people being stopped, you know, we know that it's not actually consensual, that people may make a split-second decision, you know, what's it worth for me to assert my rights? Is it worth my life? And also no-knock warrants. And the final, but certainly not the least important, one of the most important buckets of recommendations was around improving transparency and internal and external accountability of MPD. One thing we learned was that the department was not doing a good job because it wasn't contributing resources to this endeavor, and also wasn't prioritizing it, of really taking a look at what they were doing and was it working. Some of the recommendations centered around giving the public a larger role in overseeing MPD and holding officers accountable, in strengthening the oversight bodies that already exist in DC. That's the Police Complaints Board and the Office of Police Complaints, which have very, very small budgets, but are tasked with doing a lot and don't always have the power or the resources to accomplish those tasks. and also some of the things that we've heard about in terms of body-worn cameras, the police discipline being handled by or being kind of covered in collective bargaining agreements versus being able to be managed internally by MPD. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that, but don't want to take up too much time.
Thank you, Dr. Young. The additional context was very helpful as well for what's happening in the region, as well as for sharing a little bit about the recommendations. I want to transition over to Delegate Fisher. As I mentioned earlier, the Maryland State Legislature recently passed a landmark police reform package, which actually required overriding a veto by Governor Hogan. Can you tell us about the new law, which I know contains a range of provisions, and you won't be able to cover everything, but the steps that it takes to protect Black, Indigenous people of color in the state of Maryland while creating more police accountability?
Thank you, Monique, and thank you for having me here today. Wow, there's so much in the bill, and I'm so proud of my speaker, Speaker Adrienne Jones, our first Black female speaker ever in Maryland, and President Bill Ferguson leading the Senate on this issue. I think Maryland really showed up for Marylanders this legislative session, and I'm really proud. So the bill obviously repealed the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, which was enacted 50 years ago. It created an actual use of force standard, the first time in Maryland, and it actually goes beyond the constitutional in that it has to be necessary and proportional use of force, which is a big deal and which was hard fought, especially by the House. In the House Judiciary Committee, and I would be remiss if I didn't highlight other Black women and their accomplishments. Delegate Deborah Davis from Charles County and her work on use of force and pushing that. In addition, into the bill, it really takes in investigation. You know, we talk a lot about police prosecution. You know, as a former prosecutor, you can't prosecute anything if the evidence sucks. You know what I mean? So asking someone to investigate themselves doesn't really make sense. So we started the ball rolling in that. Deaths by law enforcement would be independently investigated. That's currently going to be housed in our Attorney General's office and hopefully expanded. We had a lot of debate of including serious bodily harm as well. So if you were left a quadriplegic still in Maryland, it wouldn't be external. So, you know, there's still more work to do. In addition, in the bill, you know, each county is different when it comes to oversight boards or police compliant boards. And so having more civilians on those boards, at least two, and that necessarily don't have to be appointed depending on the jurisdiction by the chief as well, so that they're actual civilians that are participating. There's just a lot in the legislation when it comes to no-knock warrants. So in Maryland now, you can only get a no-knock warrant through the hours, I believe it's 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. And it cannot be for evidence or paraphernalia. It can't be, I need the no-knock warrant because they're going to flush the drugs down the toilet, basically. It has to be because of life threatening to the officer or the situation or greater standard. And that is a big game changer in Maryland as well. So there's just a lot when it comes to different aspects of transparency when it comes to like police records. So in the state of Maryland, it's called Anton's Law, which if you all know about the death of Anton Black in the Eastern Shore area of our state, one of the officers had 18 prior complaints and actually kicked an African-American man in the face when he was down and in the face in his home state in Delaware. And so came in and was hired. And so having access to those records are super, super important as well. And so those are sort of, I would say, some of the main highlights. Also on the punishment for an officer, it's, you know, there was a lot of debate, and it won't be done by a single individual anymore. It would be not just the chief or the head of the agency, but it has to be transparent, and it has to have public participation, and also making sure we have civilian charging committees. We'll actually review the complaint process and officer misconduct in Maryland in a holistic way. And I don't want to say that there are some jurisdictions like Prince George's, Baltimore City, and Montgomery County that are already doing these things. I think I always say that this bill is the floor. You know, police accountability also, I would say to you, is quite complicated in the sense that what we passed in Maryland is the floor. It doesn't mean your jurisdiction can't go above and beyond. And that's really important to understand that mayors and county executives have a huge role to play. So in jurisdictions like Baltimore City and Prince George's, Montgomery, and others that have the bandwidth and the money, we should be and hopefully will be going beyond what was passed and overridden in Annapolis. But I think when I look at my rural counties that had none of this at all, it's a really important step to get them on board. In addition, the bill requires body camera by 2025, which, that bill has been put in several years, but there was a lot of complaints from jurisdictions on funding and storage of actual information. And the bill also seeks to address that. So there's a ton more when it comes to dismissal process and how the boards will work for officers, but I'm holistically proud of the bill. There's more to do. There are things that weren't in there. Like I specifically had an amendment for officer pensions to be taken away when you are found guilty and you've exhausted your appeals. That did not make it in the bill. I will be bringing it back along with Delegate Wilkins. So there's more to do. I would never say that the bill went everywhere, but it was extremely significant. It's becoming a national blueprint for other states right now. And I'm really proud. And, elections have consequences. Our governor did not think that the bill was worthy. And I will say there were Republicans that did vote for the bill after it was compromised to the stature that it was. So I think that speaks a lot about our governor and where Maryland is.
Thank you so much, Delegate Fisher. Thank you for the Maryland context. I want to thank Dr. Young, too, for the DC context, and Ashanti for the PG County context. Jesse, I want to go back to you. Many of the new laws that are being adopted by states and cities have similarities, mainly the focus on use of force and accountability, but like after the fact. But cities like Los Angeles, Oakland, and San Fran, yes, all California cities, have proposed cuts to their police departments' budgets. Can you define for us what defund the police means and what it looks like in practical terms? And what does the data and evidence say about the success of defunding strategies?
So I'm going to start this carefully, because for folks who have been following the public and policy discussion around defund, I mean, one of the effects of that taking so much more prominence is a much broader array of people have gotten involved and engaged in defining and talking about what that means. And I know that a lot of folks on the community advocacy front who've been pushing that have been frustrated by people like me, and say specifically in my case, white guys based at nationally prominent like policy think tanks, playing a role in defining, redefining, and maybe watering down what defund means. So I'm not one to say definitively what it means, but I do hope that I can lay down some parameters that might help, guide the conversation. I'd certainly be very interested in how, my fellow panelists think about this. So with all of that said, a couple of things I'd want to do. One is to distinguish where defund sits from the reform conversation, which I would say is fundamentally about how police do what they do. And defund is part of a conversation that's about what police should be doing in the first place, what their role should be, with the abolitionist thinkers who developed and promulgated the defund phrase in the first place, thinking the answer should be nothing because of the attendant harms to policing that we've been talking about. One framework that I often think people are talking about sometimes when they say defund that I think is helpful is divest, invest. And I like that phrase because I think it captures two critical pieces of what people are looking at. One is around the divestment, moving resources out of policing, and as an effect of that, just shrinking the footprint of policing, meaning that there should be, if you do that divest piece, fewer people having contact with police and the harms that come with that. But also it keeps the invest piece in there, because something really critical, I think, in this framework is the building of different systems of safety and care that can be less harmful and more effective. But the problems that policing and the justice system is ostensibly trying to tackle are real and serious, and you need to be doing things that are commensurate with that and putting, money into that. Now, I think we're in a real blooming and a real spreading of work of that kind. And just to keep it a little less California, at least, I would add Austin. I would add the Phoenix, Arizona Unified School System. I would add Seattle as places that have done this in various ways. In a lot of ways, we don't know as much as we will in a year or two about what this kind of defunding or moving resources would look like. I will say that there is a lot of evidence and growing around alternative response models of the kinds that everybody has been talking about, whether it's, different professionals, unarmed professionals dealing, going and engaging people in mental health crisis instead of police, whether it's around, violence interrupters or people from a public health perspective, engaging in work to reduce gun violence. So we know a fair amount about what some of the alternatives are that merit much greater investment. But I would say a lot of the evidence I'm familiar with about what happens when you pull money out of police departments has happened in austerity situations, places that were forced by budget crises to cut their police departments. And that hasn't looked good, but that tends to happen when everything's being, disinvested from. And that's not what we're talking about here. I think we're trying to have a conversation about moving investments into different kinds of things. And I think, that's something where I think we're still learning a lot, especially as the scale of ambition of a lot of those efforts has been increasing beyond what we've seen in many places.
Thanks, Jesse, and I appreciate the upfront framing on your remarks as well. I want to shift back to Ashanti. I mentioned this earlier that PG Changemakers' demands included a recommendation around redistributing existing PD operating resources. I'm wondering, Ashanti, would you characterize that demand as a defunding strategy? And do you consider it a core component of the strategies that PG Changemakers are advocating for?
Yeah, no, thank you. I think, one, it is definitely a core component of our demands and what us as a coalition are demanding. I think in terms of it being part of a much larger kind of national defund strategy, I don't think it's gotten that deep for us. We really went to some of the most impacted folks within our communities, folded them into our coalition and asked them, what do you want to see? We talked to them about what was in the budget, how the police department in 2019 spent over $25 million in just overtime, right? We talked about what was lacking in their communities and often how many communities don't have safety nets. I think one of the larger topics that we try to talk about a lot with PG Changemakers is how poverty is one of the biggest violence towards community. And until we start to address those needs, we're never going to actually address the public safety needs that police and others and law enforcement are striving to tackle. When we don't have those safety nets, when the government's not providing protections, I mean, we look at the budget for the health department during the pandemic. It was abysmal compared to what the police department was getting, right? We didn't have capacity to respond to this pandemic. And that's because we have been actively disinvesting in other parts of our government and our response and investing a lot in public safety apparatus, because a lot of times when we talk about bringing commercial folks to the county, when we talk about broadening our tax base, a lot of times when folks look at investing in the county, they look at how safe is it. And for a long time, Prince George's County has had a narrative around it of being this, black and brown, unsafe enclave of Washington, D.C. And I think for a lot of folks in our coalition, we want better investments in our community. We want to make sure that we have a health department with capacity. We want a housing trust fund that doesn't just fund lofty projects, but affordable projects. We want natural affordable housing, natural occurring affordable housing to be preserved. There's a lot of things that our county government can be doing, but they're instead investing in police departments that we see are riddled with abuse, riddled with just not the right folks. And until we clean up that mess, for us, we rather the money that we're paying into the system go towards things that are going to uplift and empower and strengthen the lives of our citizens.
Thank you, Ashanti. I appreciate the framing of invest, divest that Jesse started, but then I also appreciate you really explaining what that could look like in terms of the investment on the other side. Dr. Young and Delegate Fisher, I wonder if DC and the state of Maryland are considering or did consider conversations around that type of investing and divesting, right, as a core strategy of either the work that the DC Police Commission did for its recommendations or as part of the discussions around the Maryland Police Accountability Act. Maybe Dr. Young, could we start with you? Was this sort of a conversation, or is it part of the conversation that's happening around the DC Police Commission recommendations?
So the DC Police Reform Commission did consider defunding, and I think an interesting thing that Jesse kind of teed up is the politics around using that word, kind of like the media attention to just that word, even if you don't listen to anything else that came after it. Our meetings were public, and the headline that came out of the meeting where this was discussed was about defund. And what that really meant for the commission was what Ashanti and what Jesse mentioned about divesting and investing and doing it strategically, not just saying, cut this, goodbye, but really looking at what the role of the police department is in DC. How can we better provide public safety through alternative means? And from the commission's standpoint, that was through community resources. And once we shift responsibilities to those other resources, the money should follow. So the money follows the responsibility, and that necessarily means divesting and investing, but doing it in a way where we really look carefully at what is the department doing, what can be better done by someone else, and what are the dollars that need to follow to make that, to support that transition of responsibilities.
Thank you, Dr. Young. Delegate Fisher, were there conversations about this type of, whether we were using the language defunding police or whether we were talking about investing, divesting as strategies when you were talking about the Maryland Police Accountability Act, or are there components of it that sort of speak to and address those conversations?
Yes, 100% we were speaking about it, and I always frame it in reimagining public safety. I don't use the frame of defunding in the sense of, it's my honest belief, you get what you pay for. And so unless you want to get rid of the entire police department, if it doesn't have structure and accountability and funds, then you will have something that is also not good. So that's why I use it, reimagining public safety. And we had a lot of conversations about, as Jesse also mentioned, having a public health unit. I think there's a part of it that's going to start a pilot program with social workers and mental health experts to answer those kind of calls versus others. In the bill, it actually gives the police commission teeth, finally, in Maryland, that if you don't follow what's in the Maryland Police Accountability and in the Act, that they can actually pull funding from your department. So that is a big new step in Maryland that I think is going to help. And I also think Ashanti really laid it out very well. And what I was speaking on my earlier points is the interesting thing about being a policymaker around police is that it's an intersection between state and local, and not one has control of the other. No matter what I do in Annapolis, I cannot go to Upper Marlboro or Rockville and tell them how to do their budget and deal with how are you going to do compliance with your local little departments of all those tiny municipalities within the counties. So I think that when it comes to reimagining public safety and where you're putting your money and what you're investing in, I think that it is, I think at the state level, we started that. There's more that we can do, but when it comes to the actual money, the money is coming at a local level, and they are controlling where it is spent. So that would be your county executive, your mayor, your city councils, or your county councils. And I think, I was in for Prince George's County. I had the honor of chairing our. There's 4 subcommittees for the big work group that worked on Prince George's County Police Department reform, and I chaired compliance. And I think one of the things that we talked about was a codified metric system when it comes to punishment, when it comes to what their expectations are. It was definitely left to different supervisors and not a real system of accountability. And then I think there's also, you know, as a former prosecutor and defense attorney, you also have to have, if you're going to talk about the money in policing, you have to talk about your expectation of the men and women that are there risking their lives, and what do you expect, right? I don't expect a law enforcement officer to use their best judgment and they're on their 15th hour of a 16-hour shift. Right, that's just the reality. You are tired. You know, I also don't expect, you know, as a prosecutor, they've done that 16-hour shift, and now they're coming to court at 8:45 a.m. with me in Hyattsville, and he or she doesn't remember anything about the case because he or she is tired. And I don't know if I'm going to get justice for the victim at this point, because I don't know what my witness is at. Like, so I think we're also, to me, I will also say a part of this conversation has to be like, how many hours do you expect your law enforcement to be out there doing the policing that you want them to do? What is the training that they have? And I also have to add that there has to be, when part of building trust with police is also accountability in the courtroom. And that's really left out of this conversation, but these are the folks that are testifying on cases. These are the folks that are letting people know, no, it wasn't a big deal, just a warning, you know, type of a thing. Like it's not just what's happening on the beat. It's more than that. And I think that, you know, locals, and I'm a state representative from Prince George's County, you know, I think we have to have a clear expectation. You know, I think the expectation that police officers should be everything and answer mental health calls and everything else is wrong. And we need to put money into different ways to do that. And the reality is we divested in mental health care and other systems. Of course, my doorbell is ringing. And mental health systems, and we left that to law enforcement and jails. You know, so I think that when I talk about reimagining public safety, I think the state can lead, and there have been several bills, but it hasn't moved the way we would like in Maryland, that we really take and reimagine and relook at our mental health services that we are providing in our communities, and what trauma and things that Ashanti also spoke about in his remarks, and where we're putting that money to, so that it's not falling on our law enforcement. So I think that is sort of what it is. We can have a more in the weeds conversation about SPOs, you know, special police officers too, and like how that goes, and they're hired at, you know, a lot of misconduct happens there. You know, they're hired by a local mall and things like that. You know, my taxpayer money should not go to your local businesses, whatever. Like, you need to figure that out. You know, and we have this constant argument in judiciary and working on SPOs and you know, the fact that an SPO can be commissioned from a governor like that. There is no training standard. There's nothing. It's very interesting and complicated. And I would say that, you know, you have to bring in all of the different aspects. And I think every community has to have an expectation. You know, when I have a client, or when I'm a prosecutor, when I was my prosecutor, and I have a victim, I let them know, this is what I can do for you. These are the avenues. I will say right now, when it comes to what public safety looks like, how we expect law enforcement to react to things, and what are our priorities, it is totally off. Because I will tell you, a priority in a courtroom right now in Maryland sometimes is trespass and low guns. But I mean, when you're at different universities and things like that, where are any charges on rape and assault? I don't hear any from major academic institutions. You tell me no rape and assault happening at major academic institutions, but you always get my drunken guy who's trespassing at 7-Eleven. So it's also about where are your priorities in the laws you want to enforce. Because I will tell you, I think a lot of criminal laws do need to be adjusted, but a decent majority of criminal laws on the books in Maryland are halfway decent. It's how they are enforced and what's a priority to be brought into court that is the problem, not what the statute is on assault, or the statute says on murder, or what the statute says on rape. It's, do you want to enforce those things? Or is it easy to enforce something else? And that's really the question. So I'll stop my comments there, but it is difficult.
Yeah, I want to thank Dr. Young for the comments and understanding about sort of the political nature of use of phrasing, and honing in on sort of what we're actually talking about in terms of what's important. And I want to thank Delegate Fisher, because the point about who controls the levers in terms of the complex relationship between states and counties and cities is also, I think, a really important point for this discussion. Before we transition to Q&A, and we do have a couple questions in the Q&A box, I want to just give sort of 30 seconds for almost like a final word for each of you to sort of just talk a little bit about or comment on the potential you see or the limitations you see in the current strategies around police reform, investment and divestment, and what it looks like. And maybe, Jesse, we'll start with you. Final word, 30 seconds.
I mean, I think to speak to the limitations, I mean, Delegate Fisher said, we divested. And I think when we think about these issues globally, we have to understand, like, nothing you do in police reform is going to touch on we divested or the legacies of the way that when we did invest historically, we often drew lines around that so that only certain people, generally white people in this country, could benefit. And while there's work to be done on the reformist side, like the we divested stuff, you can't touch through police reform. And it does drive a lot of the dynamics we're talking about, a lot of the reasons why there's so much inequity in this country.
Thank you, Jesse. Ashanti?
Yeah, I just ask that folks recondition themselves on what public safety can look like for their communities. I think a lot of times when we talk about police reform, we think it's a blanketed approach. What's good for Salisbury is going to be different for South County, Prince George's, and it's going to be different for Rockville and Montgomery County. We have to stop looking at policing as this one-stop shop and really tailor it to the needs of the community if we really want to get towards a community policing model. So I just encourage everyone to really sit and think about what they feel safe around, how they think about safety, what does public safety look like in their communities, and start to unpack why do they feel that way, and ultimately, hopefully come and join PG Changemakers and help us change our community.
Dr. Young?
Yeah, I would echo what's already been said, that focusing on police and, you know, kind of tinkering around with police limits us to policing as the provider of public safety when we know they're not the best at it. And there are other people and groups and entities who are doing a really good job. One thing that was incredible for me to see in DC was a number of community organizations and just unaffiliated community members who are already doing the work of violence interruption or mutual aid, walking kids to school, those things are already happening, and that we have to trust in people, trust in the community members, trust in communities. They know what they need, invest in them to get it done.
Thank you, Dr. Young. And last, but certainly not least, Delegate Fisher.
Thank you, Monique. I would, all three are just ditto. And I would say that I would hope anyone after this call, wherever you live, you know, please know your local elected official. Follow the people that represent you on your county and state level. Follow them on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook. It's probably them, and hold them accountable. Because the more that you know who represents you and is part of that decision-making process, you can be a part of the change. I agree, we need to look at the real things that make us safe. And in Prince George's County, I can tell you, it was the uplift of our economy and federal employment. That's what makes Prince George's County safe. And I think, you know, I think it's, you know, our public safety officers and law enforcement officers, there are some amazing ones out there. And we cannot forget that there are some that I work with every day who do a stellar job. And there are some that should not wear the badge and should not ever say that they are there to protect and serve. And so we have to do the best we can to weed out bad apples, but not throw out everything, and uplift and attract people and support those that want to do this incredibly tough job. And I think that to me is the balance, because I will tell you, in my position, I just come across both so much, and it's very difficult to separate. And I think it's really, really tough for our community to feel safe and to have trust when there are people that are held unaccountable, that don't believe that Black Lives Matter, that, you know, I was talking about, you know, some of in Annapolis recently, the other party wears the blue lives with the blue line. And I was like, y'all weren't wearing that before. Y'all weren't wearing that last 3 years, but it's like, it's not about being against law enforcement. It's about being for people of color. It's about knowing what's happening is statistically wrong. It's about knowing that we shouldn't fear for our children to walk down the street and come back. And so I just encourage those that might feel uncomfortable by this discussion, or that are on the other side, that it's not attacking you. It's about keeping everybody safe and everyone feeling that they are equal and that they are protected. And guess what? Green is the same, because you are paid by people of color's taxpayer good money. And that is so important. And I just wanted to bring that up because it really bothers me that it's we're attacking an us versus them, conversation. You take a rallying cry and you morph it into something for you. It's a rallying cry for the oppression and what's going on and what's wrong. And I just hope everyone remembers that, and follow your elected official. Tweet them your concerns, call them. Because if you don't do it, I will tell you, being in the weeds, it's really tough. You have to hold your local elected official accountable. So thanks.
Thank you, Delegate Fisher. So there are a couple of questions that are coming up in the Q&A box. I think I'll start with this one, which is actually for Ashanti. Thank you for your work. It appears that the call to divest in police and invest in health and human services is not reflected in the Prince George's County's fiscal year 2022 adopted budget. What are the next steps to influence change?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think first, we have to acknowledge that there was some level of shifting of funding. I know there was a police training center that they're now going to make into a mental health facility in the county. So that's a huge plus, and we definitely want to encourage the county executive and the county leadership to continue to make investments in mental health, particularly around our crisis response unit. We would love to see capacity in every single police district of that unit, so that instead of having officers respond to crisis, we have trained professionals respond to those crises. In terms of what's next, I mean, I know there's a few more months that this current council will be together, but I think looking towards the election, making sure that a lot of these police reform asks and these acts towards investments in health and social services are part of the lexicon for this election, I think is really important to demand. I think we have about 4 out of the 11 council seats are going to be open seats, meaning that their current members are term limited. And so in districts 2 and districts 3 and districts 4 and district 6, we need candidates that are going to be speaking to these issues, and we need residents of those districts to really make that an issue for this election. I think ultimately electing leaders that come with that framework will make it only much easier for us to pass budgets that reflect the needs of community.
Thank you, Ashanti. There was a question, maybe I'll ask this question to Dr. Young, but feel free, anyone, to jump in. Hello from Chicago. Have any of the law enforcement agencies in the area began using co-responders? I know this is a big conversation nationally. I don't know, Dr. Young or Jesse, if you could speak to, or anyone, if this is something that's happening right now in the DMV, maybe starting with you, Dr. Young.
In DC, it's not happening on the scale that it needs to. It was a law that was passed by the council, the NEAR Act, and I don't want to say it's either 2016 or 2018, but in the past 3 to 5 years, that required the MPD to create co-response teams of mental health professionals to respond along with police, and that wasn't actually done. So they implemented crisis intervention training for some officers, but a very small number of officers. And they have another thing called officer agents, where the Department of Behavioral Health can deputize certain mental health care providers in the city to respond after the police have arrived to a mental health call. One thing that has changed since the Police Reform Commission's recommendations came out is that the dispatch system at the DC 911 has been expanded so that 911 can directly dispatch mental health providers to calls involving mental health crises. But that's not a co-responder model. So, when you have an event that may require some police support, which from our research is rare, that a mental health professional cannot handle, and that it's when there's a mental health crisis happening, it's a very small percentage of those cases where there is a threat of violence. So those cases are small, but in the event that does happen, there is not a co-response model in place in DC.
Thank you. Dr. Young, I want to follow up really quickly, and then I want to go to you, Jesse, because you look like you had a point for this as well. But one of the comments in the Q&A said, could you speak to the DBH crisis response teams? I believe these are co-responder models that you're saying DC may not have.
Right, so a co-responder model means there are teams of people who work together, going to the call together. So DBH, the crisis response teams are something separate. So they can be, so police can arrive somewhere and say, I'm not equipped to handle this, let me call DBH, which sometimes happens, sometimes doesn't. DBH's crisis response teams are also not equipped for emergency response. They told us that they, if somebody needs something quickly, if there's an actual crisis or emergency, MPD has to go because they are not equipped to do that rapid response, and they certainly aren't equipped to do it citywide. So there are crisis response teams, but they are not co-deployed. They are not teams of police officer and mental health professional being deployed together.
Thank you, Dr. Young, for the clarification. Jesse, did you have a point?
Bethany said everything I wanted to say and more, so let me defer so we can see if the panelists can get one more in at least.
All right, let me see if we can get one more question. Actually, I think this is an interesting question, and maybe I'll pose it. I'll pose this to Ashanti. As advocates for police reform, have you encountered resistance among government officials or law enforcement citing concerns over being able to hire police or recruit, especially attract non-white applicants? How may police work be reimagined to meet community needs, and how do you see police departments moving forward in the future?
Well, that's a great question. I think part of that too, just to break it down a little bit more, is have we received questions about why certain communities need policing while others don't? I think a lot of our advocacy has, especially around SROs, has just awakened me to the need of having conversations about class and how we see our communities. I often tell folks how we talk about our children is often how we reflect our communities. And I've been seeing a lot of, well, these schools need police, whereas these schools don't. And a lot of the conversations have been about that. I think in terms of hiring though, I haven't seen as much pushback on the reforms to say that folks won't join the department as much as folks will leave the department, which to my response is good, right? Like if they have issues with accountability, then they shouldn't be police officers. I think too, though, in Prince George's, we have a lot of restrictions to become police officers. There's a lot of hurdles and hoops you have to jump through in order to wear the badge. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't be vetted and there shouldn't be a lengthy process that weeds out folks that shouldn't be there. But if you smoked weed in the last 2 years, you shouldn't be now disqualified from being able to join the police force, especially as the nation changes our discussion and our feelings around marijuana. I think we have to reimagine even how we hire and what the practices are around that too, so that we include more community-based people. I know Delegate Fisher, though, was on the working group, and I know they talked a lot about recruitment and hiring because there isn't a huge percentage of Prince George's joining the George's Police Department. So I don't know if you want to chime in.
Yeah,
Monica.
Monique, if I could chime in really quickly.
We have like 30 seconds. But
I'll be really quick.
Ahead.
We did pass in Annapolis that marijuana use would not be a disqualifier, and that I think the way you have to recruit is more in a headhunter type style, like an actual headhunter, like a recruitment method than the mass application style that has been done prior. So I think those are two things that Maryland's doing and Prince George specifically to be better.
Thank you so much. So that hour flew by, and we heard a lot about varying approaches to police reform, police accountability, and about the need to sort of depoliticize the conversation around defunding and talk really about divesting and investing. Some approaches are supported by the data and others are going to have to take time for us to play out strategies and then take a look and evaluate. I hope and I pray that we find the right approach and or mixes of approaches that ensure communities of color are protected and safe, and that policymakers, activists, researchers, funders, et cetera, find common ground, tap into collective power, and make it happen. I, like many Black, Indigenous people of color and Black parents, are counting on folks to get this done. I want to thank the panelists, Jesse, Ashanti, Dr. Young, Delegate Fisher, for their incredible insights this afternoon. And I want to thank everyone who registered and joined us today. Today's event is the fourth in a series of events on revitalizing and reimagining the DMV after COVID-19, where we'll continue to bring together subject matter experts and local change makers working on the ground to discuss policies that will help us focus not just on where we are, but where we want to go, reimagining a DMV for all its residents. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you at the next event in the series. Have a good afternoon.